First of all, may I say thank you very much to Valerio and to Ambrosetti for having me here today. It's a great privilege to be amongst you. So I'm going to begin by arguing that money is the oxygen on which the fire of global warming burns. And we know that because since the Paris Agreement 5 years ago, the world's biggest banks have lent $3.8 trillion to fund fossil fuels. And this runaway funding for fossil fuel extraction and infrastructure fuels climate chaos and threatens the lives of millions of people. And as Bill McKibben has argued, the key to disrupting the flow of carbon into the atmosphere is to disrupt the flow of money to coal, oil, and gas. So the banks operate on what we can describe as a giant spigot create a giant spigot, which when they turn it on, creates new credit or finance. A spigot that, as I say, has generated $3.8 trillion in just the last 5 years for fossil fuels. Governments have to switch off that spigot, and only that way will we be able to control fossil fuel emissions. But they can't switch off the spigot, spewing out all this money for fossil fuels, because they've given the lead to markets and to companies like BlackRock to transform our economy away from its addiction to fossil fuels. And the reason why that's a problem was explained once by Alan Greenspan, when he reminded us that thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the United States have been largely replaced by global market forces. National security aside, it hardly makes any difference, he said, who will be the next president of the United States. The world, he said, is governed by market forces. And for me, that is a problem, as we're seeing right now in the midst of this pandemic. So the mighty United States government, with breathtaking haste, President Biden's climate envoy, John Kerry, more or less genuflected to Wall Street by paying homage to the CEO of BlackRock, and then implied that the mighty United States government was dependent on Wall Street titans to deliver good-paying union jobs. And Gina McCarthy, who's the National Climate Advisor, went even further and said, the question won't be, will the private sector buy into it? The private sector is going to drive it, she said. For me, that is a really big problem. So the reason why this is a problem is most clearly demonstrated by the European Commission, which has handed the keys to the green finance regulatory kingdom to BlackRock and is paying the company 500,000 euros for the privilege. So what that means is, and as Gillian Tett in the Financial Times has advised us and reminded us, BlackRock exploded in size and power by amassing exchange-traded funds and passive strategies which track mainstream indices, which include fossil fuels. And as she wrote in the Financial Times, BlackRock is heavily exposed to fossil fuels. Right? So why does this matter? It matters because, for example, for the past 2 years, the European Commission has been trying to develop its own public taxonomy with the purpose of ending the greenwashing that is so characteristic of ECG. And as the EU explains, this is the need for a common classification for sustainable economic activities, or an EU taxonomy. Now, BlackRock has been put in charge of that process, and the result is that we've already seen is that some brown assets will or may be regarded as green assets, and I'm thinking here of natural gas, are being redefined. So the taxonomy now is suiting the interests of the market and not necessarily of the public. So the thing about the Green Deal, the European Green Deal, which I do welcome, and I do welcome the ambitious targets, and it's clear that the Green Deal, that the European Commission is committed. It's very striking to me that it's omitted the new in the New Deal, the Green New Deal. And that's very interesting because of what we learned from the New Deal. First of all, we know that when Roosevelt was elected as president, he faced a huge, catastrophic climate breakdown, and that was known as the Dust Bowl. Across the Great Plains of the United States, the land had been eroded, had been destroyed by excessive production and extraction, especially by farmers. And as a result, there was a massive migration of people from from the Great Plains and towards, for example, California. Anyone who's read John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath knows the story. So he was faced by that ecological crisis, but he also had the crisis of the post 1929 financial crash. And so to deal with these crises, he had to, first of all, he addressed the issue of the finance sector, of Wall Street. In his inauguration speech, he said very clearly that the problem was the money changers. By that he meant Wall Street. And whom he argued, faced by the failure of credit, they propose only the lending of more money. That's the only answer that they have. And so that night he began the process of dismantling the gold standard, which was in the 1930s the equivalent of globalization, in which the markets were in effect in the driving seat of an economy like the United States. He began to change that overnight. He and his Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, were determined that a democratic government should be in the driving seat of the economy, not Wall Street. And as Henry Morgenthau explained in his memoirs, he said, we moved the financial capital from London, because in those days London was more important, and Wall Street, right to my desk at the Treasury. So that was one aspect of the New Deal, which was so dramatic and which enabled Roosevelt and Morgenthau then to begin the mobilization of finance for tackling the climate crisis and also unemployment. But there was another aspect to the New Deal, which is absent today and which Europe really needs to learn from. And that was something, again, that Morgenthau said. We have come to recognize that the wisest and most effective way to protect our national interests is through international cooperation. That is to say, through a united effort for the attainment of common goals. So we can see today from globalization that once again, Wall Street, London, and Frankfurt are in charge of the economy. And secondly, as Karl Polanyi had predicted, the rise of nationalisms is a function of globalization. And we're seeing that play out as I speak in Europe, across the whole of Europe, as governments desperately try to protect themselves and their populations from the impact of market forces, right? On employment, on housing, and on health. But of course, that is not possible in a world in which the, the markets actually are determining A, the allocation of finance, and B, whether or not fossil fuels are going to be cut. So I want to argue that state intervention, once again, is so vital that Roosevelt's New Deal is such an important lesson to us all, not just for the sustainability of the ecosystem, but frankly, for the survival of humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.